Like most people, my first formal introduction to Shakespeare was through the ninth grade English class when we read Romeo and Juliet via a textbook. Now, we didn't get to finish it because the pandemic forced us to do our work from home, where instead of continuing to read it, we watched Baz Luhrmann's film interpretation of Romeo and Juliet. While this version of the story is probably one of the most accurate Shakespeare films, down to the prologue and epilogue even being included in the film, and using all the dialogue word for word, it still decided to modernize the script and the play by having it all take place in Vienna, California, between two crime families. Having this be an introduction to the stage works of William Shakespeare had me intrigued and wanted to search for more. However, going down that rabbit hole led me to some less accurate adaptation of his work through the lens of the modern world. And now, one of the many reasons that Shakespeare is still beloved as he once was is because he's the progenitor of much modern English language and slang, which made the sometimes very hard to understand Old English much more palatable to the audiences of different languages and social classes. This made his plays more popular and shot him to arguably the most popular writer of all time. His plays still get performed all the time, and we're even seeing that now with Tom Holland's version of Romeo and Juliet and the upcoming Kit Connor and Rachel Zegler version of Romeo and Juliet. In fact, even now, my college did a community theater production of Much Ado About Nothing in the fall. And there are still countless different types of Shakespeare companies dedicated to retelling stories, such as the improvised and drunk Shakespeare theaters. The fact that this play is written so long ago are still being performed, studied, and prevailed as some of the best plays now just goes to show how masterful his writing is. However, there have been very few straightforward adaptations into the work of film. Now, there are reasons for this, with those stories being of the time that they came out, meaning that they were racist and maybe had some not great depiction of female characters, and also the acting styles of the original shows being all male casts, which now, thankfully, we are now to get actual women and people of all various types of genders in those roles. Which then leads to many writers believing that these stories should be remolded into the modern world with more modern interpretations, modern language, and just overall modern settings. But what often happens is that they exchange what made the original stories so fun and interesting, and exchange that for a modern writer trying to make Shakespeare's writing better. And I feel like there's no real better way to show this than with the recently come out Anyone But You, and the play that it was based on, Much Ado About Nothing. Now, before I get into this, I probably should do a little brief summary for each of these stories, beginning with Anyone But You. So Anyone But You begins with our characters Bea and Ben, where they meet and have instant chemistry with one another, eventually leading into a one-night stand. They both reveal insanely personal things about the other. However, when Bea wakes up in the morning, she leaves, following a typical one-night stand fashion, without waking Ben up. Ben, believing her to have left without words, begins to say some harsh words about her to his room, just as Bea decides to come back and try for a second date. And this one misunderstanding leads to Bea and Ben hating each other. However, they are forced to meet each other again when Bea's sister Hero gets engaged to one of Ben's good friend Claudia, and they are both invited to go to a nice little marriage home in Australia. At the marriage home, both Ben and Bea's exes are invited, with Ben's past love Margaret and Bea's Jonathan. The two then decide to pretend to date one another, for Ben as an attempt to get Margaret's love back, and for Bea to get her parents off of forcing her to date Jonathan. This leads to them going on romantic hikes and doing stereotypical romantic things as a show of their love. One night after rehearsal, the two attempt to do the Titanic on top of the world scene on a yacht. However, Bea falls into the water, leading Ben diving after her to attempt to save her. This leads to the pair having a little heart-to-heart on a buoy while waiting to be rescued. And when they return to the home, we get a recreation of their first night together, even ending in the same way. However, Ben is the one to leave without a word, and Bea feels how Ben felt, and the sparks of bitterness return between the two of them. The wedding finally arrives. Ben finally wins back Margaret, but he realizes it wasn't what he wanted. He runs off to find Bea and declare his love for her, ending the movie. Overall, this film just goes to show how out-of-hand misunderstandings can be, and how those misunderstandings can have a catastrophic effect on those all around us, but doesn't really have it doesn't have an interesting or nuanced conversation about how those miscommunications can form. Now, for a far more nuanced conversation about miscommunication, let's dive into Much Ado About Nothing. The play begins with Sir Leonardo receiving a letter from his friend Don Pedro that he and his brothers Claudio and Don John and his good friend Benedict are coming to stay for a few months. Leonardo's daughter Hero is happy to hear the news, but her cousin Beatrice is less excited. Pedro and the crew arrive, beginning to mill around with the family. Here, Claudio spies Hero and begins to develop feelings for her and demand to marry her. Don Pedro then comes up with a plan to woo Hero for Claudio at a masquerade ball, and then give her to him to marry. After this, Don John meets up with his friends Borachio and Balthazar to foil Don Pedro's plan and get Claudio to distrust him. The ball comes around, and both plans commence with Pedro wooing Hero and John lying to Claudio. Ultimately, Pedro proves himself trustworthy, and Claudio and Hero end up together. All the while, Benedict, while under the mask, runs into Beatrice, and the pair have a vague argument, with the two of them insulting one another. The wedding party hears their arguing, and as a joke, plans to set the two of them up by having them both believe the others into them. After failing to stop the first wooing, Don Pedro develops a more elaborate plan. He invites Borachio to flirt with Hero's servant Margaret, who would be wearing the same outfit as Hero, and be caught by Claudio and present as an infidelity. The next day, we see that Claudio, Pedro, and Leonardo go outside to discuss Beatrice's affection for Benedict. While they talk, Benedict hides and overhears their conversation and is astounded to see that Beatrice is in love with him. And when she is brought out to bring him to dinner, he of course sees this as proof of her love for him. Next is Beatrice's turn, with Hero and her mom doing the same thing as the men, but for Beatrice, and with the same conclusion being reached. And at the night of, but it's plain action and show Claudio that Hero was not faithful and cheating on him with Borachio. At the end of the act, Borachio is caught by the constables and brought to the deputy. Act 2 begins with Hero preparing for her wedding, stressed out about what can go wrong, as she calls for Beatrice to see if she's begun to fall for Benedict. But with her being sick, she doesn't really give an adder. We cut to Leonardo and the groomsmen, but the deputy and constable still meant to tell Leonardo about them catching Borachio sneaking around the grounds. But he pushes it off and thinks nothing of it. The wedding finally begins, and just before Hero and Claudio are wed, Claudio announces that Hero is unfaithful and has cheated on the night before their wedding. This leads to a massive fight between the pair, with even her father, Leonardo, taking his side. And Don Pedro, sick of the whole affair, takes most of the men, leaving Sir Benedict behind. As they leave, Hero and the remaining wedded party come up with a plan to prove them wrong by faking Hero's death and guilting Claudio to marry her cousin, who looks exactly like her. As the main party leaves, Benedict and Beatrice are given a moment to themselves to reconnect and get an honest moment between the two of them. We then cut to Leonardo and his wife arguing on whether Hero is really unfaithful. Leonardo, sick with grief, believing the accusation as his wife takes the side of Hero. This then leads to Don Pedro and Claudio showing up. And Leonardo declares Hero dead. And if Claudio would like to redeem himself, he would do so by marrying her cousin, who looks strangely alike her. Benedict arrives to affirm this is true, and if Claudio would not believe it so, or not marry the cousin, he would challenge him to a duel. At last, the deputies arrive, bringing Borachio in tow, where they reveal that he had falsely made it seem that Hero was unfaithful. And what with grief, Claudio agrees to marry her cousin. In the meanwhile, Benedict attempts to write a sonnet for Beatrice, and Beatrice a sonnet for Benedict. They are both then taunted by their various friends for actually having affections for once, but ultimately think nothing of it and affirm their love. The wedding finally arrives, and Leonardo walks to Claudio, asking once more the affirmation that he apologizes for his actions and intends to marry his niece. The pastor and Leonardo already being there, Benedict asks for Beatrice's hands and marries for the pastor to marry them as soon as they can. The pair agree, and the wedding gets underway, with Hero being walked down the aisle before she can be revealed. And Claudio must bind himself to her in honesty. And after which, she is revealed as Hero and not the cousin. The pair are reunited. Beatrice and Benedict also get married, not before Don John is fleeing, but with the deputies on their way as the play comes to an end. Now, this is granted a way bigger miscommunication and far more not only complicated, but also due to that complication, a far more nuanced conversation on just how big miscommunication can lead to problems in relationships and quickly fall out of hand, as per a Shakespearean drama. And now that I've gone over the boring part, I can finally dive into the whole reason I made this video and see just how different Anyone But You takes the original of the story and attempts to adapt it to the modern day, beginning with their protagonists. Anyone But You features Bea and Ben, which are shorthands for their Much Ado counterparts, which is off to a good start. However, this is also where our characters begin to differ. So let's start with Bea. Bea is a conflicted law student dropout who did intensely believe in love, but even within it still finds conflict. She maintains a positive attitude about life and is still deeply compassionate. However, throughout the film, we see her grapple with who she really loves and what she should do with her life past this wedding. And at the end of the film, we see her get together with Ben and realize that she does truly love him, and if nothing else, wants a future with him. While this is a good character, and I do enjoy seeing it portrayed by Sydney Sweeney, it does lack the original punch that Beatrice had. Beatrice has a lot more confidence in herself, even if it is to the other characters' detriment, leading to her clashing often with her other family members. And throughout the story, we see that she learns to open up her emotional side and engage with her romance with Benedict. And by the end of the play, she is way more open, but still the same hard and stern character. B is an attempt to give Beatrice more depth and more emotions and far more complex things than just do I love, which is a very positive thing that I mentioned. However, it does lose itself by making her more generic. Like, for example, a lot of Beatrice's positive traits, being stern, strong, steadfast in her beliefs, and never gives up, is lost in her new modern interpretation, which exchanges that for being lost in who she is, who she loves, and if she wants to do, and if she wants to be a mom. Which, again, while is an interesting character, does make her more generic, because I can think of plenty of other, but what's important is that she still remains a lot of her positive traits. For example, that Beatrice has a lot of positive traits, being stern, strong, and steadfast in her beliefs. And her modern iteration doesn't give her a lot of new traits to improve upon that, and in fact takes away some of it, and exchanges it for unknowingness and being lost in her life, which is perfect for the type of movie they're trying to make, which is a romantic comedy, but not for the story of Much Ado About Nothing, which is more of a satire. Now off to Ben and Benedict. With Ben being a little bit more true to his original character, being standoffish and stern and clings to the past a bit too much, but during the vacation we see that he wasn't always this way, and that was because he had a more emotional past, and has become stern and standoffish after losing his love Margaret. And now for Much Ado, Benedict is also given the very stern and standoffish, but however, we see his problem is a childish sense of self-reliance. Childish being the key word, with a lot of his actions, the play being intensely immature for a man of his age and of his status. But during the story, we see him open up and actively challenge his childishness and forced to grow up. And he begins to open alongside Beatrice, and after the accusation of Hero, he quite literally becomes a man and challenges Claudio if he doesn't believe that his actions were wrong. Well, Ben shows that the writers definitely had read the source material and maybe even saw it. They still, again, exchanged what made Benedict an interesting character, a man with a childish sense of self-reliance, learning that there is much more to being a man than just trusting your brothers, and instead having your own beliefs and believing them to be true and standing on your own. It exchanges that for just a cookie-cutter version of it, with just being stern and self-reliant, and never really challenges that idea. Which leads to the problem of, once again, the fact of this movie being a romantic comedy instead of a satire. But once again, the issue of this movie being a romantic comedy reads its head around, with the movie needing to have a counterbalance to B's obsessiveness with the future. We get Ben's obsession with the past, and specifically, his past romance. And while Benedict has the exact same problem as Beatrice, with him being so set in his ways that he refuses to see outside of it, and it takes a fake romance for him to rethink about who he really loves, he doesn't do any rethinking until the actual end of the movie. It takes the literal last 10 minutes of him to actually realize that maybe I don't want to date Margaret anymore, and I actually want to date Beatrice. Meanwhile, in Much Ado, Beatrice and Benedict had pretty much reaffirmed their love for himself at the end of Act 1. And Act 2 is just seeing more of their love and just how far this lie would go. Now, for a brief aside on how this movie gets the broader point of the story wrong, let's look at the couple, Claudia and Hero, and their cognates, Claudio and Hero. And this is where we get the biggest divergence from the film and the play. In the film, the two of them are just together, and they don't have any problems, which is nice having a healthy version of this couple, and it does make for a fun alternate universe of what if Much Ado didn't happen, or was way less complicated. It sadly isn't accurate, but because of them just being a happy couple, they lose their personalities and essentially just become married. And their character is just the people getting married. And also because of this, they lose plot relevance. If you realize on my summary, I didn't mention Claudio and Hero outside of them being married, because that's what the movie is. It's just them being married as a backdrop to the melodrama of Bea and Ben faking being together. Meanwhile, in the play, everything comes from Claudio and Hero deciding to get married. From Beatrice and Ben being forced, and from them faking Beatrice and Ben into liking each other, to literally every other conflict that comes from the thing, like everything with Don John and Baraccio and the deputies and everything else. And while the movie has them using that as a kickstart, it does nothing else with it. To prove my point even further, let's look at these two scenes that are intended to be the exact same scene, but are played completely differently. So let's start with Anyone But You, where this scene takes place immediately after the family had a game of charades, and Ben and Bea had accidentally set off a firework into a nice decoration.
They're going to ruin our wedding. All that matters is that we're together.
It's true.
Look, baby, I love you to the moon and back, but those two fuckwads are going to destroy our weekend. And our memories, which we are gonna have for a very long time, are headed straight over a cliff.
It's gonna be fine, baby. We just have to stand there and profess our love.
It seems to me their animus only surfaced after they spent a night together. Am I accurate?
That's usually how it goes, honey. We crumple our feelings into a ball and shove them deep down so we can enjoy a bit of frisk.
The solution appears to be simple then. We return them to the night they were smitten.
Like we tricked them into falling in love with each other?
He didn't say anything about love, honey. We just need to get them to jump each other's bones.
And now let's see what Much Ado does, again, after Beatrice and Ben had a little stiff, but Claudio and Hero had decided to be wed.
My daughter say she hath often dreamt of unhappiness and waked herself with laughing.
She cannot endure to hear tell of a husband.
Oh, by no means.
She were an excellent wife for Benedict.
If they were but a week married, they would talk themselves mad.
County Claudio, when mean you to go to church?
Tomorrow, my lord.
Not till Monday, my dear son, which is hence a just 7 night, and a time too brief, too, to have all things answer my mind.
I warrant thee, Claudio, the time shall not go dully by us. I will, in the interim, undertake one of Hercules' labors, which is to bring Signor Benedict and the Lady Beatrice into a mountain of affection, the one with the other. I would fain have it a match, and I doubt not but to fashion it if you will but minister such assistance as I shall give you direction.
My lord, I am for you, though it cost me 10 nights' watchings.
And I, my lord.
And you too, gentle hero.
I will do any modest office, my lord, to help my cousin to a good husband.
If we can do this, Cupid is no longer an archer. His glory shall be ours. For we are the only love gods. Go with me. I will tell you my drift.
The two scenes do get the main plot point right, which is setting into place the fake love of Bea and Ben and Beatrice and Benedict. However, it's how they get there that makes their distinction so important. Don Pedro, after hearing Beatrice is extremely unwilling to marry, just like how Benedict does, makes an offhanded joke. And then by a spur of the moment belief, they all decide to make the two of them fall in love, after already having proof that Don Pedro's schemes work. Meanwhile, in Anyone But You, the characters just want the two characters to sleep together as a way to keep them from ruining the main wedding. Much Ado sees the inherent comedy and fault of an arranged marriage and decides to make a mockery of it by forcing Beatrice and Ben to fall in love with each other. Meanwhile, Anyone But You sees two people that could love each other by finding themselves together naturally and decide, as we were told by the love story of Claudia and Hero. It takes the bare essentials of this original story, but takes none of the substance or the nuance. Just looking at these movies side by side, we can see even more of this, with Bea and Ben both getting a scene of them hiding from their friends as they discuss how much the other loves them. And while this is a direct parallel to Much Ado, they are played far more comedic. And what I mean by that is that they make a mockery of faking love for the other, and that no one in it is a good actor. Meanwhile, in Much Ado, they all fully believe that they're making an honest assumption. And the comedy comes from the way that the actors of Benedict and Beatrice outlandishly hide while overhearing this message. And so here's where the problem of the film being an adaptation really becomes evident, is that it's a romantic comedy. It has to be a lot more easily digestible and can't really make time for intense nuance or complicated thoughts and questions about the world. Meanwhile, with the story being a satire, you can have far more nuanced and far more intelligent conversations about what being married and being in love is. The reason why Much Ado has remained relevant, and the reason it is still taught in schools and become one of the most popular plays of all time, is that because its satire of romance and the way weddings work are just as relevant as they once were. Meanwhile, this modern adaptation takes that plot line and turns it into a modern romantic comedy that's easy to digest. One of the most important jobs of an adaptation is to tell the story as it was originally, but in a new format, and utilizes the unique benefits of telling a story in that way, or to improve or alter the story so that it can be better for the audience that it is showing to. This movie wants to adapt the original story into a more modern setting and tell a story about modern dating with concepts with situationships and rebounds and one-night stands. And while I can imagine a version of that working, and even the allusions to Benedict and Beatrice and a lot of the other events in the play, the movie only really focuses on the concept and not the thought and the nuance and the actual meaning of that original story, and made a really good satirical comedy into your run-of-the-mill Hallmark romantic comedy. Much Ado has, like most of Shakespeare plays, managed to stand the test of time and maintain its relevancy through incredibly unique writing, great satire, and a really good moral. I don't know if I can say the same for anyone but you, however. It does have good humor, but it loses the satire of arranging people to get together and not letting them fall in love naturally. It does still have good writing, but it's less unique and lacks any distinct style and is exchanged for, again, a Hallmark-style romance. And while it does still have an important lesson about living for the present and living for you, and not caring about the past or the future, it does take that lesson in exchange for a far more interesting question about the societal critiques of just how powerful a man's voice is in the world, and how letting other men speak for you, and how harmful the male-dominant power structures are, and how women are critically unheard and undervalued in those same structures. Now, both stories are, at their core, good romance stories, with things to say, and I'll never fault anyone that likes anyone but you more than Much Ado. Much Ado is an old play with a lot of older themes in it, and for some people, those don't hit as much as anyone's does. However, it does massively underestimate the sheer value of the source material, and tries to improve upon it for the modern day, and instead just becomes another bad rom-com iteration of a classic Shakespeare story.